Okay.
And then when you're ready, just move it back. Okay. All right, Dr. Fletcher, all yours.
Great. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Maggie Jones, today's seminar speaker. And I just wish I could be there in person. But Maggie is a former PhD student that was advised by Dr. Bob McCleary and myself. And she got her bachelor's degree from Denison University and her master's degree from Iowa State University in wildlife ecology, where she studied the impacts of contraceptive management techniques on social behavior in feral horses. And as she was getting done with her master's degree, she contacted Dr. McCleary and I, and we were immediately impressed with Maggie on several levels. She was clearly a very curious student, very passionate about wanting to do important work in conservation, and just very persistent. And so we brought her on to work in Southern Africa, which is not easy. And Maggie pulled it off flawlessly and developed a really strong collaborative network there, which was good for the university, good for SNRE, good for the department, good for everyone, honestly. And she did that because by really just being a fully engaged person in the field when she went there, and also doing a lot of training locally with, she worked on two different kinds of training programs. One was a program that we run called International Research Experience for Students, and she ran that flawlessly. She also ran a Women in Science course with Nasani Trust in Southern Africa. And in doing so, her impact is, she's going to talk about her research today, and her research is fabulous, but her impact was goes so much beyond even what she's probably going to talk about today. So she was a real pleasure to work with. I'm really excited about her research getting published. She just got a response back from a journal today where where one of her chapters looks like it's going to be published soon. So great work, Dr. Jones, and I look forward to continuing to work with you. She's now a postdoc at the University of Florida. And yeah, I hope everyone enjoys your seminar.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate it. Great. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I am sort of losing my voice, so I apologize ahead of time. Just bear with me as I get through this today. So I am currently a postdoc, like Rob said, working with Bob McCleary in WEC, and I'm still working with Rob as well. But I recently finished my PhD in SNRE working with Dr. McCleary and Dr. Fletcher in WEC. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about my dissertation research, focusing on the effects of large mammalian herbivores on savanna communities in Southern Africa, with a particular emphasis on the effects of these herbivores on savanna trees. So we know that large mammalian herbivores shape the structure and function of ecosystems across the globe, but since the Pleistocene, we've seen a decline in the number of these large herbivore species and also in the abundances of the remaining species. And we see this across the globe for a number of reasons, including overexploitation and habitat loss. And so this has raised concern about the consequences of these changes and these losses of these large herbivores for ecosystems across the globe. And so this is a particular concern in African savannas. These are some of the few systems that still have a full suite of herbivores, everything from small rodents and invertebrates up to mega herbivores, which are animals over 1,000 kilograms, such as elephants, rhinos, giraffes that have been extirpated from much of the world, but still remain in these systems. And so savannas are characterized by a continuous C4 grass layer and a discontinuous woody canopy. And this heterogeneous vegetation structure supports a unique set of biodiversity. And it's maintained by both bottom-up forces like climate and soil conditions, as well as top-down consumers like fire and herbivores. So we know that these herbivores are really important in maintaining this heterogeneous vegetation structure. And in African savannas, we see many of these problems that we see globally. We see a loss in these species and population abundances of herbivores. And then at the same time, paradoxically, we also see some increases in these herbivore populations in certain savanna systems.
So sorry, I'm going to share the screen actually.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's on me. This is the second one, right?
Yeah.
It's okay.
Oh.
You did what?
Oh, I think just, yeah, actually. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry about that. Sorry for everyone on Zoom. Hopefully you're with me now. Yeah, so in African savannas, we generally see a loss in many of these large herbivores in terms of species and population abundances, but in certain savannas, we actually can see rapid increases in herbivore populations, particularly in protected areas. But with both of these issues in mind, we still need to get a full understanding of the roles that these herbivores play in African savannas in order to understand what the consequences of these changes in herbivore communities will be for these systems. So, okay, this is something happened with formatting there. But so there are myriad roles that these large herbivores play in savannas. First, generally, we think about how they affect savanna vegetation. This is what we know the most about. But we still lack a clear understanding of the mechanisms underpinning these effects. So particularly how large herbivores affect demographic parameters like survival and recruitment that drive the population dynamics of savanna plants. And then even though we have a pretty good understanding of the effects of herbivores on savanna vegetation, we don't quite understand as well how they interact with other forces that shape vegetation at the same time, things like drought and fire. And then finally, while we tend to focus on their effects on vegetation, there's also some evidence that large herbivores affect other animals in savannas. And often we think about this happening indirectly through their effects on savanna vegetation, which can alter resource availability, for example, for other animals. But there's some limited evidence that they can also have direct effects on other animals, for example, through interference competition. So today we're going to sort of walk through all of these different roles that these large herbivores play and sort of break them down a little bit. So we'll start with looking at the mechanisms underpinning the effects of large herbivores on savanna tree populations. Then we'll add in a factor here and look at how mega herbivores interact with drought to affect savanna trees. And then we'll add on a link to this story and look at how mega herbivores can affect the behavior of smaller herbivores, either indirectly or directly. And then we'll break down this behavior piece a little bit more by thinking about how these prey species assess and respond to risk in the environment. So starting with the effects of large herbivores on savanna trees, again, we have a pretty good understanding of what's going on here, but we still see variation in these effects across savanna systems, and this can arise from a number of sources. So this could be because of have something to do with the herbivores themselves, the herbivore communities, different types of herbivores having different effects on trees, or it could be due to characteristics of the trees themselves. So for example, we could think about different life stages or sizes of trees. So we might expect elephants to have larger impacts on large adult trees, while smaller herbivores like impala might have stronger effects on seedlings or smaller trees. We can also think about how these effects might vary across tree species. So for example, if on the top here we have a highly defended tree species, lots of structural anti-herbivore defenses, that might be very effective against something like an impala, not so much against elephants. And then we might have other species like on the bottom here that might have overall weaker defenses and have similar effects across herbivores. And so while we might expect the magnitude of these effects to vary across tree species or size classes, we might also expect to see a difference in the direction of these effects. So generally, we think of this effect to be negative because herbivores tend to consume trees, but in some cases, they could actually be positive. For example, if a tree is dispersed by these herbivores. And so that sort of leads us into another aspect of this variation that's important to think about, which is different demographic pathways. This is particularly important to think about if we want to be able to predict how changes in herbivore communities might affect these tree populations in the future. And so generally we think about how herbivores affect tree survival. So it tends to be negative, limiting survival, although in some cases it can be positive, for example, with grazers that limit grass competition. But we know less about how they affect tree recruitment. So this could be positive, facilitative, like we mentioned before, with animal dispersal or increased germination rates with gut passage, but we also have plenty of seed and seedling predators on the landscape. So we wanted to look at how, sort of break into these nuances of how herbivores affect survival and recruitment of these trees, looking at what best explains savanna tree survival rates, whether it's the type of herbivore, whether it's species-specific responses or specific to different tree sizes or a combination of these factors, and then what best explains recruitment rates. So we conducted the study in Kruger National Park, which is a large, about 2 million hectare park in northeastern South Africa. And our site was located in the southeastern portion of the park. And just to note here, this is a very productive, nutrient-rich area that supports a high density of herbivores, particularly elephants. And so over the last couple of decades, we've seen a sharp decline in the number of large trees on the landscape. So this is just an example of what this landscape looks like at the moment. And so ideally, to be able to look at how these different herbivores affect survival and recruitment rates, we would want to track individuals over time, individual trees over time, and isolate the effects of these different herbivores. So we did this using a large herbivore exposure experiment that was set up in 2018 as part of the Browse Project, Biodiversity Research on Wildlife and Savanna Ecosystems, with all of these collaborators. And so we have a bunch of 70 by 70 meter plots, and they're distributed across 3 different exposure treatments. So on the left here, we have our full exclosures. These are fully electrified fences that exclude everything larger than a hair. And then in the middle here, we have our partial exclosures. These just have wires at about 2 meters in height. So they only exclude mega herbivores, so elephants and giraffes. And then on the right, we have our control plots. These are unfenced and allow access to everything. So we have 15 of these plots, and in 2019, 2020, and 2021, we went out, fully searched these plots and tagged all individuals of 3 common savanna tree species: knobthorn or Senegalian aggressans, redthorn or Bachelia gerardii, and marula or Sclerocaria berea. And so we tracked the survival and height of these individuals over time and fully searched the plots each year to find any new individuals. And then we used this data to estimate annual survival and recruitment rates. And we used capture marker capture models here because we were worried about imperfect detection. So like I said, we have very few large trees in the system, and the grass is super tall out there. So a lot of our trees are small and actually below the grass layer. So these models allowed us to account for potentially imperfect detection. And then we estimated annual survival rates and allowed that to vary by exposure treatment, tree species, tree height, and year. And then we also estimated recruitment rates. And in these models, it's defined as the number of new individuals per individual in the previous year, allowed that to vary by exposure treatment, tree species, and year. So these are our results. And on the x-axis here, we have our different exposure treatments. So we have our controls on the left. In the middle, we have our mega herbivore only exposures. And then we have our full exposures, excluded mega and large herbivores on the right. And so our most parsimonious model for annual survival found that it varied by exposure treatment and by tree species. So we have survival rates for our 3 tree species here. And what I want you to take away from this slide here is that in general, the strongest effect that we saw on survival was when we excluded mega herbivores. So the middle points and the right points, we saw an increase in survival, suggesting that mega herbivores tended to limit survival, but only for these top 2 species, for knobthorn and red thorn. We didn't see that for marula. In fact, we saw that when we excluded large herbivores in the second year, we actually saw lower survival, suggesting that they might have facilitated survival in some way. And these are our recruitment results. So for this model, it was best explained by variation across species and year as well. But we didn't see much variation across exposure treatments, suggesting that these herbivores didn't have much of an effect on recruitment rates. So to bring this all together, we see these interesting species-specific responses of trees to herbivory. Again, the strongest effect that we saw was this limiting effect of mega herbivores, but this was only for 2 out of our 3 species, where we actually saw some facilitation for the other species. And then we didn't see any effects on recruitment. So data like this, using these demographic estimates and with caution, projecting them into the future, can allow us to look at how tree populations and communities might change over time with changing herbivore communities. Okay, so now we see a little bit more of these nuances in how herbivores affect savanna trees, but so far we've looked at this in a static environment, but we know that's not reality. There are lots of other changes happening in these savannas at the same time that these herbivore communities are changing, for example, climate change. So across the continent of Africa, in general, we see an increase in the frequency and intensity of droughts with climate change. And we know that both drought and large herbivores can limit canopies in savannas, limit the survival of trees. But what we don't know really is how they interact with each other, whether they just have additive effects or whether they actually interact and have synergistic effects. So that's what we wanted to look at here. What are the effects of both drought and elephants specifically on large trees in savannas? And are those effects synergistic or just additive? So for this study, we used data from, again, Kruger National Park, same site as before, and then also Flanae Royal National Park in Eswatini. And both of these sites have very similar climatic and edaphic conditions. The main difference here is that while we have a high density of elephants in Kruger, we have no elephants in the part of Flanae where we sampled. They've been extirpated for over a century at this point. And so at both of these sites, they're affected by a severe drought from late 2015 to early 2016, and we were already collecting data on these sites. So we were lucky enough to get data from before the drought, during the drought, and after the drought to look at changes in the abundance of large trees on these landscapes, and basically allowing for this natural experiment to look at how drought and elephants interact. So these are our results here. On our x-axis, we have before the drought and after the drought. Our y-axis is the number of large trees on our plots. And then the blue points are our site with elephants in Kruger. The reddish points are our plots without elephants in Flanae. And so on the left-hand side here, this is the data for all tree species combined. And we unsurprisingly saw that both elephants and drought limited the number of large trees on these plots, but not in an interactive way. However, on the right here, when we looked at just knobthorn Senegalian nigrescens, which was the dominant tree species on both sites, we did see evidence for an interactive effect. So we saw a larger decline in the number of large trees when elephants were present, suggesting a synergistic effect. So this could be because elephants were foraging on these trees more during the drought when other resources were less available, or these trees were more vulnerable to damage by herbivores during the drought. So as we expected, we see that elephants limit large trees, not surprising. Also that drought limits large trees, not entirely surprising, but the magnitude of this effect, particularly in the site without elephants, was surprising. So as drought intensity and frequency continues to increase, we're likely to see a decline in the number of large trees with these events. And then if we add in elephants to this equation, likely to see a further decline in the number of large trees, but also potentially a shift in the composition of these communities, depending on species-specific responses to drought and herbivory. Okay, so we've got a good overview of how these mega herbivores affect trees. What if we add in another link to that and think about how they affect other animals? There are a number of ways that mega herbivores, and particularly elephants is what we'll focus on today, how they can affect other animals in savannas. And we can think of these in sort of two main categories. We can think of indirect effects. So elephants change vegetation structure and composition, and this can then alter the availability or quality of resources for smaller herbivores, or it could alter vegetation risk or predation risk by changing vegetation structure. So that's how we typically think of these effects playing out. But there's some limited evidence, and this generally comes from observations at waterholes, that elephants can have direct effects on the behavior of smaller herbivores through interference competition and potentially even eliciting fear responses. And so we wanted to tease apart these two potential mechanisms for how elephants affect the behavior of smaller herbivores. Like I said, generally the focus is on these indirect effects, but at the same time, this is from another study that we're doing at the same time is what I'll talk about in a minute, looking at how ungulates responded to elephant vocalizations compared to predator vocalizations, so leopards in this case. And I just want to show you an example of these fear responses and what we saw, how these guys actually did respond to elephants. So see if this works. So this is a leopard. Okay, so pretty strong fear response there with the impala fleeing pretty immediately from leopard, as we would expect. And then this is an impala responding to an elephant. Pretty similar, strong response there as well. Very interesting. If you want to learn a little bit more about this study in particular, this was recently published in Biology Letters. So we see that there is this potential for fear response there. So we wanted to tease these apart and look at how influence really influence ungulate activity and to see whether those varied across ungulate species. So to do this, we used a field experiment where we had these different treatments that tried to emulate the effects of elephants in savannas. So we had our habitat treatments. We manipulated habitat in the way that elephants manipulate habitat. So we knocked over some trees, pulled up some shrubs, even brought in some elephant dung. And then we have our behavioral treatment where we tried to emulate the presence of elephants using vocalizations. So I'll show you an example. So that's an elephant trumpet. So that's one type of vocalization we used. And that's an elephant rumble. So that's what you heard in the previous video. It's this really low frequency, but it's the most common vocalization they make. And then we had our control plots where we played these non-predatory birds. We have our emerald spotted wood dove that we played during the day. And that's our fiery neck nightjar that played at night. Oh. There we go. Okay. So we conducted this study in Lula Nature Reserve in Eswatini, and we had 16 plots separated into 4 blocks. And within each block, one plot was assigned to one of each of these treatments. So we had one plot that just had their habitat manipulations, one that just had behavioral manipulations, one that had both behavioral and habitat manipulations, and one that had those control bird sounds. We set up a couple of camera traps at each plot, monitored them for about a month, and then looked at variation in visitation rates of ungulates across these treatments. So these are the overall results that we found for this. So on our x-axis here, we have our different treatments, our control, behavioral treatment, habitat treatment, and then the plots that had both habitat and behavioral treatments. And then on the y-axis, we have the number of visits by ungulates per day. So we can see that overall, both the behavioral and habitat treatments tended to reduce visitation rates. So ungulates seem to generally avoid areas where we tried to emulate elephant effects. So despite these overall negative effects of both of these treatments, when we looked at this on a species by species basis, we saw quite a bit of variation in how these different ungulate species responded to elephants. So for our larger species, our Inyala and Kudu, we actually saw positive effects of these treatments. So this could be due to an increase in browse availability with these habitat manipulations, or potentially some indication associated with elephants of higher habitat quality. Then for our smaller species, so our Impala and Warthog, we actually saw negative effects, like those general overall effects, particularly for the behavioral treatment. So that's where this sort of fear response comes into play. Elephants are really big and pretty scary. I'm pretty scared of them when I'm in the field. So I think it's unsurprising that they seem to elicit some strong fear responses. So we see that fear of both predators and these large competitors can affect prey behavior, but what actually triggers these fear responses? So we wanted to dig into this a little bit to understand how prey, like these smaller herbivores, are assessing risk in the environment and how they're responding. So there's a number of types of information that prey use to assess risk in the environment. These include direct cues that are produced by the predator, so things like visual, auditory cues, predator urine, things like this, or indirect cues. And this could be cues from other conspecific prey, so cues from injured conspecifics or conspecific alarm calls, similar cues from heterospecific prey, or environmental cues, so things like vegetation structure or moonlight that alter perceived risk. So there are a number of reasons that prey might respond differently to direct compared to indirect cues of risk. So for example, indirect cues might be good indicators of risk from a variety of sources, while as direct cues might just indicate it from that one specific predator species. So in that case, you might expect stronger responses to indirect cues. However, direct cues might have more accurate and precise information about the location or identity of a predator and might elicit stronger responses because of that. So that's our information precision hypothesis. And then according to the threat sensitivity hypothesis, prey should respond according to the level of threat indicated by cue. So often our conspecific indirect cues, things like cues from injured or killed conspecifics, indicate an actively foraging predator, whereas cues from the predator might just be released at all times, might not indicate that the predator is actually foraging at that moment. So they might respond more strongly to the indirect cues in that case. So despite all this interest in these different hypotheses about what types of information should be more reliable, we still don't have a good understanding of whether prey tend to respond more strongly to direct or indirect cues of risk. So that's what we wanted to look at. We wanted to see across taxa whether prey exhibited stronger responses to one type of risk or the other, and if combining these types of risk elicited a stronger response than either in isolation. And then we also wanted to dig into that a little bit more and look at whether differences in those responses depended on the source of the cue. So whether it's a conspecific or heterospecific, for example, or the sensory modality of the cue, so auditory, visual, etc. And so we did this using a meta-analytic approach. So we searched the Web of Science using these search terms, and then went through the titles and abstracts of over 6,000 papers and selected papers that met these criteria. So they needed to experimentally manipulate at least one direct and at least one indirect cue of predation risk and measure some type of behavioral response. So that left us with 104 papers, and then we extracted a bunch of data from those, the effect sizes of the behavioral responses to these different cues, and then all this other information that we included in our models to look at variation. So these are our overall effect sizes. So we have our hedges effect size on the x-axis, and then our cue type on the y-axis. So direct cues, indirect cues, and then combinations of direct and indirect cues. So we found that combinations of these cues tended to elicit stronger responses than either type in isolation. That's what we expected, and indicates that these types of cues likely contain some sort of unique information that, when combined, gives more reliable information about a threat. But we didn't see any overall difference in responses to direct or indirect cues. So we wanted to look at that in a little bit more detail. So first, we looked at terrestrial versus aquatic systems. I'm just going to talk about terrestrial today because it's a little bit more relevant to what we've been talking about so far. And so here, again, effect size on the x-axis, the y-axis here is our cue source. So we have cues from predators, conspecifics, heterospecifics, and environmental cues. And then we have our sensory modality represented by these different colors. So we have visual cues in yellow, auditory cues in blue, and then chemosensory cues in this coral color. So overall, at least for terrestrial systems, we did see variation between terrestrial and aquatic systems. But for terrestrial systems, we saw weakest responses to heterospecific cues, which is not entirely surprising. These are likely to be less reliable, potentially less relevant to the prey that are actually responding. And then we tended to see stronger responses to visual cues, and the weakest responses actually to chemosensory cues. So we didn't see overall effects, differences in the effects of direct versus indirect cues, but we did see that the context of the system really matters when we're thinking about how prey assess and respond to risk. So it matters who you're getting your information from. Is it a conspecific or a heterospecific? How that information is being transmitted, and where you are, which again, all of these things interact with each other. And so this hopefully has some conservation and management implications in addition to just giving us some more information about predator-prey ecology. So as we've seen before, we know that fear can elicit strong behavioral responses, whether it's fear from a predator or a large competitor. And they can do that through direct cues, but you're likely to get a stronger response when you add in some other indirect cue, like a cue from a conspecific or an environmental cue. And so this is important to keep in mind when considering things like non-lethal management with fear, for things like invasive species or human-wildlife conflict. Okay, so overall, sort of bringing our whole story back together, we've looked at many different ways that large herbivores can shape savanna communities. So first, looking at how they shape tree populations, we see that the strongest effects tend to come from these large mega herbivores in terms of limiting the survival of trees. But we see importantly differences in these effects across tree species. So not only can they affect the structure and number of trees in the landscape, but also potentially the composition of these communities. And then when we add in things like drought to the mix, we see likely even stronger limitations on these tree communities. So fewer large trees on the landscape, potentially further shifts in composition depending on species-specific responses. So we add another link onto that, and these effects of mega herbivores on vegetation can also have effects on the behavior of smaller herbivores. Not only that, but we can also see direct effects, and these types of effects can have different directional effects and different magnitudes effects on different species. Similarly, they are likely affected by predation risk in the environment from actual predators as well as these competitors. And these changes in behavior that we see are likely to then feed back onto and affect the structure and composition of plant communities through changes in habitat selection, foraging time, things like this. So we see these feedbacks that are likely to amplify the effects of these large herbivores. And so when we're thinking about how to predict and fully understand how large herbivores affect these systems, how changes in these communities will shape savannas in the future, we need to really carefully consider all of these links. And so that's about all I have. I just want to thank my advisors, Dr. Rob Fletcher and Bob McCleary, the rest of my committee, Dr. Lawrence Kruger, Todd Palmer, and Phil Hahn, my labs and lab members for all their support and collaboration, a bunch of folks that I worked with in the field and that guided me through these new systems, Lele, Emmanuel, Allison, Corley, Ben, Don, lots of people over there, and then a bunch of students that were really invaluable in getting all this data together and taught me a lot over my time here. So, and thank you all so much for being here and listening. And I'm happy to take any questions if we have time.
So I do have a question. When you decided to look at the two separate national parks specifically for elephants as the megafauna, or the mega herbivores, not megafauna, the mega herbivore effect on the fauna, flora? I'm so confused at all the words.
Yeah.
Basically, what I'm trying to say is, why did you decide to only look at elephants instead of like elephants and giraffes or other mega herbivores?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's sort of the main difference between those two sites. We've been working in those sites for a while now, and Silfane does have like some giraffes and things, but they don't have elephants. So just logistically, that's the main difference, is the difference in elephants. But more broadly, so I sort of mentioned this at the very beginning, but there's a lot of interest in savanna ecology, African savanna ecology right now, in this, what people call the elephant paradox, where across a lot of the continent, there's concern over declines in elephant numbers, but in protected areas like Kruger, for example, their populations can increase like almost exponentially. And so that's raised a lot of concern and like what those impacts are, how to potentially manage that. So that's another reason that a lot of the focus of our research tends to be on elephants in particular.
Awesome talk, Maggie. You pulled together a ton of different studies and experiments that could have all these different threads, but weave together beautiful things. So, and really great videos. I'll try to speak up in case people are so noticing, but kind of on that last note that you were talking about folks and elephants, I think I'm wondering about the focus upon the antagonistic roles of elephants, whether they have facilities. And
yeah,
I don't know savannas that well, but I do hear narratives. There are places where the elephant population is increasing a lot. That could be potentially destructive to those natural human managed landscapes. But in one of your early experiments, I think in the exclusion, mega herbivore exclusion plots, you said that there was possibly an increase in recruitment. It was recruitment there was a decrease in recruitment when all herbivores. And I just want to give you an opportunity to kind of riff on why that might be the case. Are there facility walls and herbivores that are seed dispersers to fertilize the soil?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Definitely. I don't want to seem like they're all negative effects, even though that's generally, like, we generally saw these negative or limiting, I guess, effects on survival and things. But absolutely they can have facilitative effects. I think this is the slide you're talking about. So yeah, so here in particular, what we see is when we exclude both mega herbivores and large herbivores, just for the second year, we saw an increase or a decrease in survival. So that suggests us that just those large herbivores, so not elephants, actually the other like antelopes, things like that, potentially facilitate survival. That could be for a couple of reasons. It could be because they limit rodent populations that are big seed and seedling predators in this case, or they could be, there are also grazers in there that reduce grass competition and facilitate tree survival in that way. So I think that's probably one of those is what we're seeing there. And we actually, when we set out with this in particular, we really did expect to see facilitative effects of elephants on recruitment, particularly for marula. So marula is dispersed by elephants. Elephants are the primary dispersers for marula. So I mean, I think there are a couple of potential reasons that we didn't see facilitative effects in this study. One of them being a lot of the marula, like I said, we don't have any large like adults trees on the landscape. And particularly for marula, they're all very small trees right now, so they're not really reproductive. So I think if we had different initial conditions, we'd probably see more of that facilitative effect there. But certainly, yes, certainly elephants can have positive effects. So they disperse seeds. They also germination rates for marula and some other species are increased when they pass through the gut of an elephant. Elephants do redistribute nutrients in a way that sort of is not the same as other herbivores and distribute it more homogeneously throughout the landscape. So they're very important for a number of reasons. We just happen to not really pick up on a lot of those effects in our studies, but they're definitely
there. Hi, Maggie. Congratulations on all of your work. It was very interesting to see all that you have done. Just keeping this thought about the survivor, reduced survivor, do you think that it happened nearby the parent plants, and if it could increase the diversity overall of the areas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think something that following this, we'd like to look at more is sort of like the spatial arrangement of these different trees in adults and in juveniles. So in this in particular, I think we did look at reproductive status of trees. We only had like a couple of this top species knobthorn that were reproductive. The rest are all just really small, and that limits, like they're not reproductive because they're so small. So we didn't look at distance to adult trees. Also, I will say for this, most of this recruitment seems to be resprouting. So it's not true new individuals in the population. We only found true seedlings. We found a couple of marula true seedlings, but the other two species, we didn't find any true seedlings. Yeah, so we didn't look that here, but definitely something really important. All of these species have like different neighborhood sizes and different dispersal distances. So yeah, I think that'd be really cool to look at in the future.
I was wondering, since we did see an interaction in the survival whenever you had the drought and the elephants, how much of their water content in their diet is typically coming from like their more diet than actually going to a water source? And then in the severe drought, are they completely unavailable to like watering holes? Or
yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know exactly what the breakdown for that is. I mean, certainly water is less available in terms of watering holes, but also in terms of getting it from their diet more, like, because they tend, during the drought, they tend to like chew a lot on bark and things like that. So just overall much more limited, but I don't know. I don't actually know what the breakdown of that is, and if that might play into this, but it'd be interesting to look at. Most of the work I've done sort of focuses on the aspect of just grass is less available, which is more nutrient rich. forage for them. And so they tend to switch to trees when they have to, when grass is less available during droughts. But yeah, I'm not sure how water content plays into that. Thank you so much.
John,
Thank you.
that